to Internal Audit, our dedicated Facebook Live series. Today's session is about tackling fraud, and I'm joined by Andrea Deacon, Forensic and Fraud Risk Services Director at RSM UK. Internal Audit has an important role to play in ensuring that management has effective systems in place to detect and prevent corrupt practices within an organisation. This is part of its normal role of supporting the boards and audit committees' oversight of risk management. But it's not the job of internal audit to directly detect or prevent corrupt practices. That's for executive management. Internal audit's role includes promoting anti-fraud and anti-bribery best practice, testing and monitoring systems, and advising on change where it's needed. So grab a tea, glass of water, I promise it's water, and join me and Andrea as we delve into tackling fraud. So to start, some introductions. I'm Liz Sandwith, I'm the Chief Professional Practices Advisor at the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors UK and Ireland. The Chartered Institute is the only professional body dedicated exclusively to training, supporting and representing internal auditors across the UK and Ireland and across all sectors. We have approximately 10,000 members in all of these sectors, in all of the economies across all parts of UK and Ireland. And our members are part of a global network of internal auditors of over 200,000 members across 170 countries, all working to the same international standards and codes of ethics, or code of ethics, sorry. May I also remind you that you can acquire CPE points from today, and those guidance of those are available on our comment sheet, and you can use the CPE template that the Institute has created. So today's topic, tackling fraud, a practical hands-on session. As internal auditors, we know our organisations need a strong programme of internal controls to combat corruption and fraud, and that includes top-level commitment, raising awareness, measures to prevent, detect and manage the damage arising from corrupt practices and fraud, and a risk assessment process to identify the risks of corruption within the organisation. Internal audit's primary role is to offer assurance at board level that such controls are in place and functioning effectively. We often refer to them as preventative and detective controls, don't we? Controls that prevent something happening and detect it when it does. Some organisations may not have sufficient capacity in the executive team to deal with fraud, where exceptionally management requests internal audit to undertake fraud investigations. The chief audit exec, head of audit, should determine that they have the required mandate and expertise and that resources are not being diverted from higher priority internal audit work. They should also ensure that the audit committee endorse undertaking such work and that their role and responsibilities in relation to fraud is clearly documented in the Internal Audit Charter, which will have been approved by your audit committee. So one quick takeaway, have a look at your audit charter and make sure there is reference to internal audit's role in relation to fraud. Remember, if you like Facebook streams and want to spread the word, and I'm sure you do, be sure to share today's live stream. You can do that by clicking the share button in the top corner of your screen. After all, the more the merrier. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream Talk to Internal Audit. Today's session is about tackling fraud, a practical hands-on session with our guest speaker, Andrea Deacon, Forensic and Fraud Risk Services Director at RSM UK. But before I introduce our speaker today, may I just remind you that there are some IIA standards that relate to fraud? Standard 1210A2, internal auditors must have sufficient knowledge to evaluate the risk of fraud and the manner in which it is being managed by the organisation. But you are not expected to have the expertise of a person whose primary responsibility is detecting and investigating fraud. And 2120, again A2, the internal audit activity must evaluate the potential for the occurrence of fraud and how the organisation manages fraud risk. So just before I hand you over to Andrea, may I give you some top tips for internal auditors? We need to ensure our organisation is aware of the current emerging fraud risks. We need to provide assurance that current policies regarding potentially damaging attacks are constantly reinforced, particularly during this remote working. And when I talk about attacks, I'm thinking perhaps hacking or cyber attacks, or just an individual disgruntled employee who is attacking your organisation by committing fraud. We need to focus on the work of those who are monitoring suspicious reporting to ensure that their level of alert is maintained. We need to provide a valuable source of information to the business of the nature and example of current reported attacks. So don't forget to use things like the internet for your particular sector to identify anything that you can see coming down the track. We also need to support our business in any way possible to reduce the impact of these risks. So, without further ado, may I please welcome Andrea, our guest for today. So Andrea, over to you.
Many thanks, Liz, and welcome to everybody joining. So I've worked in the counter fraud arena for over 20 years and started my career as an internal auditor. And over this time, the area of fraud prevention and investigation has seen so many changes and emerging areas, processes and good practice over those years that I feel the sector is in a great position to share so much knowledge and experience along with lessons learnt and top tips. So hopefully you'll be able to take some of these away with you following today's session. So touching on some of those key areas outlined by Liz in her introduction, it's just so true that organisations need strong programmes of internal control to combat fraud and commitment. And this carves out the culture of the organisation, its level of tolerance to fraud and corruption, and with many of then as a consequence have adopted a zero tolerance approach. We often get asked the question, so what does good practice look like? And it can be hard to demonstrate because it's just not one size that fits all approach. But there are some key elements that can support your internal role, in an internal audit role, in ensuring management have effective systems in place to detect and prevent fraud and corruption. So in my session, I'll cover some of those key questions we're often asked by our clients, what a counter fraud strategy looks like and key components of that, and how it can support the work of internal audit, covering areas of proactive and reactive investigation work. Ways that you can offer assurance at board levels that fraud prevention controls are in place and functioning effectively. Looking also at areas of emerging risks, so what we have seen during the pandemic, which you may have already had some exposure to in your work, or may be able to use some of the knowledge from this session to feed into your internal audit work going forward. So some of the key questions. So firstly, ensuring that our organisation has that strategic and top level commitment, as identified by Liz, to the objective of countering fraud and corruption is just so essential. And what we go on to discuss during this session won't be achievable if that support and commitment at the senior level of the organisation are not in place. So some questions and discussions that we're seeing and hearing from our clients and board members when discussing the topic of fraud, whether they feel they have sufficient assurances that fraud and bribery risks across the organisation are being actively managed, where they fail to receive any frequent timely reports on numbers. We are being asked requests as to what does good practice look like, what is the frequency of reports, what's the content of reports, what information should be transparently and regularly reported to board members, in respect to fraud, bribery allegations, and also the sanctions and any areas of system weaknesses that have been identified and what then is happening in future about those areas to mitigate those risks occurring in the future. There is also a nervousness over the level of resources to invest in fraud and bribery prevention work. So we will touch on the proportionality of this investment, as many are concerned that and asking the question whether they do have the right level of experience and expertise available to them should instances of fraud investigations arise, as an example. So in dealing with these points, we have seen a clear move from both regulators and organisations to really outline their expectations around the counter-fraud agenda. So just if you are just tuning in, welcome to our Facebook live stream. So it's Talk to the Internal Audit, and I'm Andrea Deegan, Forensic and Fraud Risk Services Director for RSM UK. And today we're talking about tackling fraud. So I've just this moment briefly introduced the discussion, and we'll now move on to some of the areas of emerging risks and the counter-fraud strategy. So many, as I said, organisations are now encouraging to put in place counter-fraud strategies. And the key component of these strategies are to reflect organisations' commitment and approach to countering fraud and bribery. They generally cover those areas I highlighted, which are that strategic commitment, awareness, prevention and detection, and reactive investigations, all inclusive of sanctions and redress. So taking these in turn, I'll also be providing some indication of where the role of internal audit could be applied through this process. So firstly, the tone from the top, and that strategic sign up to the counter-fraud strategy is so vitally important. So having a robust counter-fraud policy and investing proportionately into counter-fraud resources is what you'll be able to demonstrate as to whether there's that organisational commitment and investment in the counter-fraud strategy and the resources that come as a result of that. One key component is awareness, and we touched on this just briefly in terms of the communication of that counter-fraud agenda, making sure people are aware of what would constitute fraud, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable in terms of fraud and bribery. And it's essential that organisations have a programme of awareness and training to embed a clear understanding of what constitutes these areas, what policies and procedures are in place to support this, and what should be done if fraud is suspected. This is an area where we've seen many of our clients really wish to drive through their organisations programme and workshops of awareness, and even more so on the fraud risk assessment side, and actually getting those within organisations to contribute to the fraud risk assessment process and contribute to that culture of embeddedness of the fraud prevention culture. A further element of the strategy is the area of fraud prevention and detection. So ensuring that there's a process in place, which is often where internal audit get utilised in order to confirm the robustness of fraud prevention controls, and where internal audit reviews can really be scoped in a way that would have that opportunity to detect fraud if it was happening. In being able to identify those areas for fraud prevention resources to be invested, it's critical that the organisation undertakes, as I mentioned, this fraud risk assessment. The outcomes of this will enable the organisation, and hopefully through liaison with internal audit too, will be able to identify the greatest areas of risk, so adequate resources and investment can be made. And there's a clear transparency then as to where, because it's not infinite resource, it is quite limited. We're not suggesting everyone should have a massive investment in countering fraud resources, but ensuring that it's proportionate and the resources that are available are directed to the areas of greatest priority. So these areas will then form part of the determining the resources and where that investment can be made to such areas. So whether in the short term or as part of a longer term strategy. So when introducing fraud risk assessments, we find that these start off with reviews of the most common areas of common known areas of fraud. So generally covering finance risks, HR recruitment, payroll risks, procurement, and last by no means least, and the one that we've seen a bit of an increase in, especially during the pandemic, is the one of cyber related risks. So as you'll probably be more familiar with reviews such as those of board assurance frameworks as an example, these work very much in the same way. So regarding identifying what the inherent risk is, what controls then and assurances are already in place, how these impact on a residual score, and then really importantly, what action is then taken to record and undertake work across those areas where risks or high scores have been identified in order to reduce the level of associated risk going forward. So the outcomes of the fraud risk assessment do feed into longer term counter fraud strategies, and are also, as I mentioned, that tool that internal audit can really consider when drafting their areas of work for coverage. And this will then enable a balanced level of prioritisation of the resources that are available. Just now to just turn and give a flavour of some of the areas we look to concentrate on as areas of when undertaking a fraud risk assessment and reviewing the associated controls in place. So as I mentioned, we do highlight these across some particular common known areas of high risk. So first, looking at HR, one of the areas we look at is around recruitment. So whether staff have been subjected to the appropriate level of pre-employment checks before commencing employment with the organisation. There is an increased risk that people can be employed without having the necessary qualifications and experience to fulfil the role if those robust pre-employment checks aren't undertaken. And ultimately, the organisation may be liable to criminal and civil liabilities if the employee doesn't have the right to work in the country where they're looking to seek employment. What we have seen, and I'll come on to this when we talk about the areas during the pandemic that we've seen emerging areas of risk, is the workforce opportunity, undertaking pre-employment checks through remote working, through remote sources, looking at scan documentation, holding up documentation to screens, the opportunity for alterations to those and for them not to be genuine documents. What we've always promoted is looking at hard copies. We're not in the environment where that's necessarily been possible, so it does highlight heightened risk around such areas. Working whilst off sick, this is one of the areas that gets greatly reported to us in terms of investigation, normally through peer-on-peer reporting, but really where the prime employer isn't aware that the member of their staff has secondary or private work commitments. We've seen an increase in this area during the pandemic as people have been working from home, potentially set up other businesses, undertaking private work commitments, agency working, and so the increase that we've seen around working whilst off sick has been pertinent during recent times. Also in the area of HR, and probably also sits a bit more with the governance, is an area that we've seen a lot more attention and it being on the agenda of many of our clients and organisations, is around declarations of interest. So where the robustness over processes, because what we often find, if we're brought in to undertake an investigation, sometimes this can involve undeclared interest or where conflicted interests have been declared, but they've not been managed appropriately by the organisation. So what we look at from a fraud risk assessment process is what arrangements are in place. Is there a template declaration form? Does that contain the relevant disclaimer? Because this could weaken any potential fraud case and increase the risk of non-compliance of fraud. Undeclared interest caused by a failure to manage and monitor potential conflicts can also result in reputational risks and breaches of statutory requirements. So we are taking a slant on this. We've sort of changed our focus and really moved this much onto employees and workers to actually say they have a duty and it's really in their best interest for them to declare any potential conflicts of interest to avoid there to be questions over their personal or professional integrity in their day-to-day role of employment. And what we also feed into then around declarations of interest is that gifts and hospitality. So again, looking at whether there is a template declaration form in place to contain the relevant disclaimer, as again, it could weaken instances of fraud investigation if there isn't, and really setting that tone and culture within the organisation as to what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable around accepting or declining gifts and hospitality. And I think reminding there around the potential committing an offence under the corporate offence of the Bribery Act is the risk that we're really looking to mitigate against when undertaking that work. So moving on to some of the areas of finance risk, these are a bit more familiar that we come across, and processes and controls have been enhanced in many of these areas. What we have seen though is the work of the fraudsters and the techniques that they are using around some of the key known areas of finance risks is increasing, and being aware of those and those emerging areas of techniques is really important, because what can happen is, if we're unaware of those advanced techniques, what controls we used to rely on we think are working effectively, unaware that the fraudsters are one step ahead. So an example of this is, I'm sure you're all more familiar around sort of the invoice fraud and mandate fraud attempts, where receipt of an email asking for your usual supplier's bank accounts to be changed was quite a common area of fraud that was known probably, say, 4 or 5 years ago. And what we used to advise in terms of good practice was making sure you contacted the supplier from your held data, not using the data that comes on the email or the paperwork, and use that as your main source of call. Fraudsters are now intercepting genuine suppliers' details. They have facilities for voice impersonation. So even picking up the phone, that could be diverted to the potential fraudster. The fraudster can use voice impersonation to sound like the supplier you're expecting to speak to. And I think fraudsters have also found where the spell check is, because we used to be able to identify a lot of email potential fraud through the use of poor grammar, the way that emails were addressed, and they seem to have heightened their level of information and how convincing it could be when it's received by somebody who doesn't necessarily have the mind to be checking that beyond reasonable doubt and may inadvertently make a payment, which is what we've seen at some of our clients. Even though they do have fraud awareness training and they are conscious of the types of fraud, some of these elements have impacted on them because they're just not aware of the emerging areas and techniques available. Touching on some areas of payroll fraud, some of these are quite common. I'm sure you pick up many of these in your internal audit roles, but where things like timesheets, or fictitious timesheets are submitted by employees, false or inflated travel, subsistence claims. What we have seen obviously with lockdown is a reduction in the number of expenses that are being paid. So the risk of that may have potentially been reduced just by virtue of new working practices that are in place. Things like bank overtime and time off in lieu, fictitious claims again, and employees being paid. Also ghost employees. So we've actually enhanced the way that we look to try and detect fraud existing within ghost employees, salary overpayments and duplicates, looking at using data analytics where we can identify similar bank account details, similar names, similar dates of births, and instances where individuals may be diverting payments into their own bank accounts, and we can pick that up, and we have identified instances through using data analytics. And the benefit of that is using and identifying a greater percentage of total claims that can be reviewed quite easily. And then one of the areas where I picked up on was around the procurement. So this is where, again, as part of that fraud risk assessment, we invest some time in looking at the procurement. We've recently undertaken a benchmarking piece of work across our clients, which we found really valuable, and our clients did too, around single tender waivers. So looking at this before COVID, during COVID, and seeing if the activity from our clients was in line with what we were seeing across other clients in our portfolio. So the use of single tender waivers, whether that was breach of SFIs or whether it was being used to avoid due process rather than genuine instances of difficulty or a supplier suitability. Obviously, during COVID, we've seen an increase in emergency supplies being requested, but it has identified some housekeeping issues as well, and also instances where we've had to then deep dive further into some of the instances to confirm that there's no untoward practice. And also touching on those in terms of tendering and invoicing, so looking at the competitive tendering requirements, whether orders have been deliberately placed below tendering thresholds of organisations in order to show favour to a particular company and avoid detection. That's one of the common areas we see, and we need to make sure that our clients have suitable and robust controls in terms of mitigating those opportunities. And then just finally, in terms of IT, and I said that this was one of the areas in terms of specifically around the cyber fraud awareness, is one where we've seen a great increase over the last 12 months or so in terms of the attempts that are made by cyber attacks, and to try and the opportunities there in terms of cyber fraud attempts. So looking at making sure there's a confirmed and robust IT strategy in place, looking at cyber fraud awareness, and really this is around staff as well. So staff being aware of what constitutes cyber fraud risks. If your IT security doesn't manage to prevent cyber attacks on the organisation, it's often the staff members are the one where that reliance is placed upon. So having a robust strategy around cyber fraud awareness is really key to ensure that awareness is heightened and people know what the consequences are of clicking on links, as an example, and what impact that can have if it's from a fraudster attempt. So having undertaken a fraud risk assessment, you've then got an indication of some of the potential areas of coverage, and considering the outputs from that will lead to directed prevention and detection activities. So what does this ultimately look like? As we say, prevention of fraud is always better than the cure. So involvement of internal audit in fraud prevention work, such as policy and procedure reviews, can act as a valuable contribution to the effectiveness of these. Ensuring their content is legislatively sound, reflective of good practice. Where possible, using internal audit can be a great source to promote effective implementation and embeddedness of policies through audit work. Findings and ensuring compliance with those fraud-related policies in light of emerging risks is essential. So we've seen this happening much more in the current climate, and where internal audit are utilised to review policies, processes that may have been amended or flexed to accommodate different working practices during the pandemic, whether that be a change in authorisation processes or security controls due to home working, just as an example. And me personally, I've worked closely with our internal audit teams to undertake some COVID risk assessments to identify the range of things that may have changed, and then where we would then make a decision as to whether we undertook proactive work or whether internal audit undertook an internal audit in a particular area. So that really joint working has really brought some real benefits to clients. So then just looking at the detection activities. So our fraud teams work closely, as I said, with internal audit when undertaking detection work. Being involved from the stage of scoping the reviews helps ensure that coverage is set with the likelihood of detecting fraud if it was occurring. More recently, these have been used, as I said before, using data analytics, ensuring that areas of fraud risks are appropriately covered. So having a programme in place where fraud detection reviews will be undertaken should all be illustrated in this counter-fraud strategy document and demonstrate the organisation's commitment and investment into proactive areas of work. So moving on to the area of investigations as well. So if we don't manage to prevent fraud from happening, we don't then manage to detect it if it was occurring, it could then lead to the area of investigation. So as Liz mentioned, investigations can be resource intensive, can sometimes pull on resources that would usually have been invested in delivering your internal audit work plans. So as such, it should be supported by your organisation's anti-fraud and bribery and response plans, as well as Liz mentioned, the internal audit charter that's in place. And it's important that investigations are conducted by suitably trained individuals. So it will not only provide some comfort and assurance to the organisation over their level of risk exposure, but by having the rightly experienced individuals conducting the work and investigations, can also act as a level of assurance to those people who feel concerned about potentially reporting fraud, giving them some comfort that if they did report something, that it would be handled in a professional way and by trained individuals. We found is a real indicator and reliant then on the numbers and activity, and the opportunity for people to raise such concerns is much greater. It's good practice for an organisation's fraud response plan to be held separately from the anti-fraud and bribery policies. So when I'm saying that, I think there is an element where you do have to state within the anti-fraud and bribery policies, this is what the process is for reporting fraud, this is who you should report instances to. But there does have to be an element of the response process where things like the securing of evidence, detailing how investigations will be undertaken. We've sometimes found that by including that within the fraud policy can give a bit too much insight to those that are the subject of the investigations, and it can then sometimes compromise how the investigation could be conducted. So if you've got potential subject or somebody who's been alleged as part of an investigation, the last thing you want to do is to be telling them that we're going to do X, Y, and Z, we're going to look for all the evidence, we'll secure the evidence. If I was the fraudster, I'd make sure I destroyed the evidence beforehand, because I know that that is what you would then be going to look at. So I think keeping that specific and remote just to those that are available to undertake the investigations, those that are accredited or experienced or allocated that role and responsibility, still enables there to be consistency in terms of a process, but yet then also doesn't compromise how the investigation can be conducted. So following an investigation, the follow through to the appropriate sanction and redress is vital in order to promote the organisation's, as we said, the zero tolerance approach, that is what your organisation has taken. And alongside progression of the case to the appropriate sanction and redress, the promotion and awareness of such cases is encouraged. And there's historically and over the years there's been a bit of debate around this. So if a case is investigated and there's ultimately sanctions and redress that is applied, some organisations have been quite refrained from promoting. I think initially from a reputational embarrassment element that fraud's been committed here and we haven't identified it until it's X, Y, and Z down the line. But there is really a culture now of actually promoting that and enhancing the awareness of the cases. Not only confirms that you've now put things in place to stop that happening in future, but can enable other organisations to benefit from your experience and make sure they don't fall foul of the same fraud being committed against them. So I think there's a bit more openness and transparency around actually let's promote this, let's promote it within the organisation, and make sure people know what we found, how we found it, what happened, and really important around the sanction and redress to act as that deterrent. If we don't apply that zero tolerance, then there's no sanction then to deter people from committing fraud. So it's a really important area. What is also important and to be covered by the strategy is some clarity over how your organisation will record, monitor and report on instances of fraud which are raised, and also the impact and findings of proactive work. So outlining these processes does confirm that one, there are arrangements in place to promote transparency and completeness, and enables the board members or senior executives to get some comfort that the strategy is being delivered, that it's being monitored, and that they will get timely information back to confirm the progress against the strategy. What we don't want is that there's a counter-fraud strategy in place that is literally a document to confirm compliance with regulators or with organisation expectations, but actually that is being used and it can be monitored. And actually the key performance indicators and metrics that come as a result of that are really important to be able to report upon. So we've covered in some detail key elements that would form part of your organisation's counter-fraud strategy, involving some of the work that we do around those areas and where there are opportunities for you to get involved in that from an internal audit perspective, whether that be undertaking or reviewing after the event. And you can contribute to the implementation of, as I said, and delivery of that strategy. So just moving on, what are the ways you can offer assurance at board levels that fraud prevention controls are in place and functioning effectively? So as we highlighted earlier, a key source of assurance to board levels are, one, having robust policies in place, having that completed and updated fraud risk assessment process, outcomes are managed in line with your organisation's risk management policy, and visibility over how these translate then into proactive areas of work, reviews or audits being undertaken. A clear programme of those proactive reviews so that board members can take some comfort in where resources are being directed over the year and plan for future years. Does your board receive regular reports on fraud and bribery allegations? and the outcome of investigations. It's useful to have a timetable when progress against the strategy and any predetermined, as I said, key performance indicators, updates on themes, areas of system weaknesses. All those things can be reported. It'll help in affording the board comfort and visibility over what is happening at an operational level. So that's the area really around the counter fraud strategy, the fraud risk assessment. So just wanted to touch on now some of the areas of emerging areas of risk, because this is also fundamental in producing that strategy document and your fraud risk assessment. It will only be relevant and up to date at that certain point in time. So it's really important that there are processes in place to ensure emerging areas of risk are captured too. So looking at risks that we've seen either emerge or heighten due to the move to home working, I think is a good place to start really, what we've observed, what we are now seeing. And there are some of the key risks that we've identified in some key case examples. So one of the key areas, and we touched on this when I mentioned about fraud risk assessment and looking at recruitment. So employee fraud, we've seen really heightened during the pandemic and through home working, where recruitment processes for full-time or temporary staff, the inability to validate original documentation and evidence such as identity checks and DBS checks. One case I was involved in recently was where a potential recruit was requested to scan a copy of his DBS certificate and submit that to the recruitment team. The recruitment team thankfully referred it to ourselves for us to have a view on this, and you could see that there were two different shades of white between the paper. And when drawing a line from the top to the bottom of the paper, it shifted over to one side on the bottom half. And through investigation, it identified the top part was genuine and related to the individual that was applying for the job. The second part, not so much, that related to somebody else. And the person was not wanting to disclose a criminal conviction with fear of that impacting on his opportunity to secure employment. So really reliant on the members of staff and their work in validating this to identify those concerns and report it appropriately. We've seen instances of abuse of isolation and sickness, so people claiming to be sick or isolating in order that they can then go on to perform secondary employment or private working, reported by colleagues. And I think we've seen a real increase in colleagues reporting colleagues. And we see this often where there are instances of change or where potential jobs are at risk or where everybody is contributing or everybody is finding it hard. Those that then are in the minority of abusing processes, employers, for example, colleagues tend to become aggrieved at that. So it's really important that there's not only that response plan and awareness over how to report concerns, but that there are instances in place to capture that information and encourage those reports to be made. So it tends to be where colleagues are aware and they don't agree with then the practices that individual fraudsters, as we say, those that are abusing the processes and systems are taking. And we've also had, as you probably expect, non-completion of working hours. So with this balanced against those that are exceeding working hours, and we have had instances where people haven't been able to be contacted, not necessarily identifying employee fraud, but identifies where there needs to be greater management in terms of remote working, home working arrangements that are in place. In terms of finance and procurement functions, we've seen many finance processes being streamlined to cope with the remote working, with suppliers, expediting processes for payments to suppliers. We've seen use of e-signatures. One of my clients introduced use of e-signatures to third parties, so external suppliers, and then chose to introduce it internally as well. And it took a matter of days before the use of an employee's e-signature was used on a payroll amendment form. And it was only by the knowledge of the payroll officer that she spoke to the individual employee to clarify that they had submitted the request, it had their e-signature on, and they confirmed it wasn't something that they'd requested. So within a matter of days, that system was being abused. Wider authorisation and use of credit card usage for emergency payments for those that needed to procure goods that were outside of normal practice. We have seen some of our clients increase credit card usage, and really then looking at whether those authorisation levels stay in place after on when we get back to business as usual, and avoiding sort of widespread authorisation of credit card usage if previously you had a process where you really kept it under control and with limited exposure. And just finally, in terms of finance and procurement, really looking at the relationships and the use of new suppliers for emergency processes. So where due diligence standards that previously would have been applied haven't been done so because of emergency and because of the environment we've been working in. And what we are encouraging our clients to do is make sure that those due diligence standards that were previously in place, if you haven't been able to do at, the first point of bringing them on board, make sure that you still undertake such checks going forward and before you just continue to have a recurring relationship with such suppliers. Then we've also got the cyber-enabled fraud. So the massive increase in phishing and whaling attempts, opportunists and organised crime. One of my clients authorised a payment to a fraudster, thinking it was a genuine Director of Finance email address, didn't hover over the email address, didn't go knock on his door because she was working from home, and submitted the payment thinking it was a genuine request, and the payment then received by the fraudster. And what we did actually see in that case was how this opens the floodgates to, you must then get put on this list, because then everyone within the finance team were getting similar requests, and I think it just then flagged that actually the processes can't be that robust within this organisation, so the more attempts they were then seeing as a result. And then we've also seen things like, as I mentioned, language and spelling terms which were used to previously flag concerns haven't done so going forward because the techniques that are now being used by the fraudsters have increased and have become a lot more sophisticated. So elements of these frauds have taken place and on occasion been successful due to things like home working, juggling homeschooling, work tasks alongside home distractions, and then also not working next to your colleagues, where we'd usually ask them directly whether something was not being then readily available to discuss with colleagues. We've seen a lot of these frauds occurring by consequence of these elements. So how these impact on internal audit work and activities. So make sure you have a tool and mechanism to remain up to date and aware of emerging areas of and types of fraud risks, enabling you to be alert and also fraud proof any known areas of associated weaknesses. And before we close the session, I just wanted to spend a few moments talking through a few common questions that we often get asked. So one of these being, so what are the 3 most important things to consider when reviewing counter fraud arrangements at an organisation? So hopefully you'll be all able to answer this after this session, but in honesty, those 3 key parts would be ensuring that there's an effective counter fraud strategy in place, that there are robust policies and procedures to support effective controls, and that there are a comprehensive risk assessment that sits behind this. And all of this provides for an effective proactive fraud approach. What are the areas of greatest fraud risk exposure? And these change, I think, in the environment we're currently in. So internally, very much around staff and employee fraud. And externally, I think, as we've touched on, the greatest risk is around that cyber fraud and the opportunists to commit cyber attacks and fraud through that means. Then also, what's the hot topic on the agenda? So one of the areas we are seeing, which doesn't necessarily by virtue identify as fraud, but there is a greater investment at the moment regarding the governance and compliance and reporting of conflicts of interest. So I touched on this when we were talking through the fraud risk assessment elements, but this is something within the control of your organisations, and that they do have the opportunity to make sure it's really robust and reflective of good practice. And it can often prevent many of the fraud investigation elements. So the impact on internal procurement arrangements, greater awareness of employees, and protection of, as I said, their professional and personal integrity is really high on the agenda at the moment. So in summary, I hope you take away some valuable insight into the practical approach to tackling fraud and where the role of the internal auditor fits into this. So ensuring your organisation has a strategic commitment to countering fraud, which is supported by a proportionate counter-fraud strategy. Undertake a form of fraud risk assessment so you can demonstrate where the greatest areas of risk exposure are and put plans in place to mitigate against this and those risks where you can. Adopt a robust recording and reporting process for presenting to board, governance, senior executive meetings, and be alert to areas of emerging risk and when things may need to be put in place to mitigate against those risks and protect yourselves. So thank you for your time now, and I'll hand back to Liz.
Thank you ever so much, Andrea. That was really great. And I'm certain there's lots and lots for everyone to think about when they hear what you have to say. One of the things I was particularly pleased to hear you talk about was the fact that organisations are now promoting the instances of fraud within their organisation, and perhaps where staff have been terminated for that, because it used to be something that was perhaps swept under the carpet a little bit. So I think that's a real positive message and is a really strong deterrent, perhaps, for others who are thinking about behaving inappropriately. So just a quick theme reminder, if you are joining us, welcome to our live stream Talk to Internal Audit. Today's session is about tackling fraud, a practical hands-on session with our guest speaker, Andrea Deegan, Forensic and Fraud Risk Services Director at RSM UK. So may I say a huge thank you to Andrea for joining me today, for sharing her thoughts with us. Lots, as I said, for all of us to reflect upon and perhaps share with our internal audit colleagues. Don't forget, the live stream is available afterwards for those of your friends, colleagues who may have missed the live version on the Institute's Facebook channel. And don't forget to follow all our exciting things that the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. As a member, of course, you have access to the latest edition of our Audit and Risk magazine, which is available on our website. And the latest version is a digital version of Audit and Risk magazine. The past year has shown us how we can transform rapidly in a crisis, and we must build on this to meet the challenge ahead. The pandemic is not the only factor significantly changing the way we do business. The government's consultation on audit reform and the imperative to boost confidence in business and the UK economy post-Brexit are also clear indicators that further developments are in the pipeline. Whilst all organisations have been through a turbulent year, we cannot take our eyes off the ball now, especially in view of the pace of change, and we mustn't slow down as we head into the future. So the highlights in the magazine include the Audit and Risk Awards shortlist, the benefits of collaboration, and an opportunity to meet the new IIA Global President. The Audit and Risk Awards recognise, as I'm sure you're all aware, the high standards of quality and integrity vital to the success of internal audit, as well as rewarding the innovation delivered by teams and individuals who are at the cutting edge of the profession. We've just announced the shortlist. As I mentioned, it's in the magazine. And now you know who's been shortlisted. Why don't you join us on the 25th of June and be there when the winners are announced? Book your place at this year's awards ceremony that's taking place online, and it's free. Auditing fraud and financial crime is also one of the training courses we're offering in 2021. Fraud and financial crime pose significant risks to the financial health and stability of any organisation. Internal audit need to be in a sound position to provide management with proactive and up-to-date assurance over the effectiveness of controls in these key areas. This course will provide you with the knowledge and tools to audit these risks. Cybercrime and crisis management is one of our new courses for 2021. And Andrea has spoken about cybercrime as part of her session for us on fraud in organizations. So this course is something worth thinking about. High profile issues are always in the news. A business being hacked, a company being stopped in its tracks because it has altered its systems, or something that appears completely out of the blue. On top of these unplanned or unexpected events, creating hard to handle incidents arise from the most unexpected circumstances. And the course will help you better understand cybercrime and extreme event crisis handling and the controls that should be in place to help protect your organization. Details of both of those courses can be found in the comments section of this live stream. In other news, the Institute has recently launched a brand new community hub for all of you to get involved in, a new gateway to all our community-focused activities and endeavours, including our virtual forums, regional network activities, and volunteering opportunities. And there you'll find a list of all our special interest groups. So if there are any that pique your interest, reach out. Our community hub is open to all, members and non-members, and draws on our learnings from the COVID-19 period. So watch this space as it continues to take shape over the coming months. As we move forward and into the future, please don't forget to look out for Talk to Internal Audit. All of the live streams that we did in 2020 can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't yet watched any, be sure to subscribe. A link to our YouTube channel can be found in the comments section. We will continue to share with you our thoughts regarding specific challenges, along with input from colleagues, members, and guests. So do stay in touch. The next Talk to Internal Audit session later this month will focus on a practical guide to internal audit planning. Our speaker, Heidi Denton, will share a practical case study and her thoughts around internal audit planning. So please join us. If you have any specific topics you would like us to cover, please share your thoughts in the comments box. As always, I'm happy to take questions via email at liz.sandwith@iia.org.uk. Remember, talk to internal audit, because the Institute is listening. Take care, stay safe, and I hope you have a great summer. Thank you.